Are we all one consciousness? This is something that you might have heard, and you might not realize that aside from just appearing in New Age texts and that sort of thing, that there's something that's interesting that's going to happen with brain-brain interfaces. So what's happening right now, for instance, with Neuralink and other experiments across the world of actually doing brain implants to allow communication, for instance, with computers. So now we have brain-computer interfaces, but soon we'll be able to connect brains to other brains directly in terms of sharing that electrical activity and communication, sharing that information, even in a very promiscuous fashion where there's a high bandwidth connection between the two, which, by the way, is what Neuralink's mission is, to be able to provide that high bandwidth communication. But what is that going to be like? What is it going to be like to actually experience that sort of thing? And what does the history of the self and of mysticism tell us about what that's likely to be like? There might be more reason to suspect than you may imagine that something strange is going to happen when we see brain-brain interfaces emerge. Are we all one consciousness? Where is the boundary of the self? And what is it going to look like when you have two selves that are actually connected, where the brains are connected via these interfaces? What's going to happen to their individual identity? That's something that is potentially going to be very, very interesting. And I want to get into this by way of a story. So I had a student who, this is one of the beauties of teaching philosophy, right? So people bounce ideas off of me all the time. I love it. And this student suggested something with metempsychosis, which is the transmigration of souls between bodies, and saying that, if there is any kind of truth to this, in the sense that the ancient Greeks described it, for instance, where you were, dipped in the river of Lethe and you forgot everything. That was oblivion, the river of oblivion and forgetfulness. And so you forget your previous life and then the soul moves on to a new life. Well, if it's like being unconscious, the student argued, then you actually don't experience time, which means that if this takes 1,000 years for you to move between bodies or for your consciousness to awaken in another body, you wouldn't notice it. It would be like being under a general anesthetic in surgery, where you don't experience the time. You have the IV and you're kind of looking at things, you're looking around, maybe they tell you a joke or something, to settle you down. And then all of a sudden you wake up and it's like, oh, it's over. There's literally no experience of time whatsoever. And this is what was interesting about this student's idea, is that if indeed that, you give any kind of credibility at all to metempsychosis, this is just a thought experiment and reincarnation in that way. If there's no time gap, then that points to a very different kind of consciousness of what's going on there and movement between bodies. And it got me thinking of what was going to happen when we first connect one brain to another brain with especially a high bandwidth connection. And high bandwidth connections between brains, by the way, that's part of the mission, the stated mission of Neuralink. Like, you open up Neuralink on the main page, there it is. They want to create high bandwidth connections. And a high bandwidth connection, it's not just to play Pong. It's not just to play computer games or to be able to type or to be able to cure paralysis. Those are great things. I mean, don't get me wrong, that's amazing. But what's going to happen when we connect two brains together for the first time? What's going to happen when we connect via a brain-brain interface so that you have two of these things connected between people? Because it's not a one-way connection. It's not as though the electrical stimulation only goes from the brain to the computer. It goes both ways. And so it's possible then to stimulate the brain as well as the brain stimulating the computer. And so because of that, it's going to be possible for two brains to communicate, which, by the way, at the speed of light. And so this is well under the threshold of any kind of linguistic communication or anything that would allow us to have an illusion of separateness. So it would happen faster than the speed of thought, so to speak, which means there's something strange that's going to happen potentially with individual identity. And people are raising this and kind of scratching their heads and saying, okay, that's probably going to be really weird. What is it going to be like? And people first, in our society especially, because this is arguably the more common version of it, they'll first point to something like, well, some people with drugs have kind of similar experiences. And, maybe it's possible for them to, because they'll report that the self is an illusion, or that they've standing outside of themselves and they have this kind of oceanic consciousness, and pointing back to someone like Freud or whatever. So that's all well and good and interesting. If, there's a little bit more experience there, then they may point to something like meditation and say, okay, well, people also in meditation point to an evanescence of the self and realization that we're not in control of our thoughts and that the self doesn't have any coherence. There's no kind of internal consistency, and that from one moment to the next, there is no stable background of identity. And I think that is perhaps a great deal more useful in what it is that we're likely to find in terms of what's going to happen when we have this interpenetration of brains, such that it's possible for one brain to, via a very high bandwidth connection, interact with another brain. And this, by the way, doesn't have to connect every neuron of the brain to every neuron of the other brain. We don't use every neuron of our brains. And that's not because we're lazy or anything of the kind. It's because the brain is actually very layered. It has a history. And you can see the brain's history by looking at its structure. There are certain structures that we share in common with the animals. There are certain things that just regulate, heartbeat and lungs and breathing and muscle control. And all of that is maybe not all that terribly interesting. Although being able to think and control someone else's body would be very strange. And I'm sure people will do that and it'll be weird, but whatever. That's not the most interesting part. The identity that we have as selves, our identity that we construct at a certain age, which, by the way, we're not born with, right? I mean, we've had psychological theories for the past 100+ years that describe this, and that's only within recognizable psychology as a discipline, right? Schopenhauer was talking about this 100 years before, but nevertheless. So, and then Hume even before that. So we've been thinking about this stuff for a while and thinking about the idea that the self itself is not coherent. It does not have consistency. And because of that, I think there's something that's going to be very interesting, and we're going to be able to experience it firsthand with a brain-brain interface in a way that has just not been open to very many people. Now, when a meditator experiences this, it's likely to be strange, but it may not be quite as shocking. Whereas if you take somebody who's really worried about losing their identity and really afraid of death and afraid of not having the persistence of their own individual personality over time, that might be really disturbing to them. That's the kind of person that I would worry about experiencing that kind of thing, because they are likely then to dive in feet first to essentially mystical waters and to find out what it's like not to have a self or not to have a firm boundary of the self, and to all of a sudden realize that me and this other person, me and the rest of the world, there's no difference. There's no boundary. What I thought to be a boundary was in fact an artificiality. It was a construction, and it's a construction which, by the way, requires constant maintenance. Our notion of self requires constant reinforcement and maintenance, and it will start to fall away and start to blur over time without it. And so society reinforces it. Our interaction with objects reinforces it. There's a lot of literature in the last 100 years of people talking about how it is that even our, the things that we use reinforce social values and that kind of stuff. And that's all good and well and right. But the core question of the construction of individual identity and the maintenance of it, that's something that is going to come into question when we encounter these devices and actually experience firsthand what that's like. And this is the sort of thing that you don't even necessarily have to experience it yourself firsthand. This is going to be spread out into the culture as soon as people start to experience it. And they say, by the way, if you've got one of these implants and you do this with another person, you're going to have this kind of experience. And we're going to study it, and people are going to have all kinds of interesting theories about it. But fundamentally, one of the things that's going to happen, I think, is that it's going to show us where some of the limits of self are and just how fragile our self-identity actually is. So we have the illusion that our identity as a self is something that I am me, and somehow I've always been me, and that's this thing that is unassailable and is somehow holy and has a value, as of, Locke and the others in the Enlightenment several hundred years ago. And so that's kind of been enshrined as a value in our society. But in fact, the self is not really all that terribly consistent, and we change from one day to the next. And arguably, you reconstruct your reality and yourself, at least in part, and you have changed even through something as simple as sleeping. And the more extreme forms of that are examples like what you get, of course, with Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was the railroad worker that had that really unfortunate incident where, something blew up and it drove a spike clear through his head, went through and took part of his brain with it. And it didn't kill him. As a matter of fact, he walked to the doctor with someone else with literally a hole in his head. But what was interesting about this, of course, and what has been most interesting as an example for the past 150 years for people, is that his personality changed overnight and that he became a different person. Why? Because part of his brain materially changed. It was missing. And arguably, it was a part that was concerned with inhibitions. And so he became a bit more animal, was prone to alcoholism and violence, et cetera, and had a lot of problems, unfortunately, from there. But that story has a lesson for us in the sense that, you have very minor changes in the form of, sleeping or changing ideas or just growing up and growing older. You have that all the way to extraordinarily major changes like Phineas Gage and in all forms in between, which simply point to the fragility of the self. Anyway, I think we're going to get to see that firsthand with brain-brain interfaces. And that's going to be really interesting because the mystics, I suppose, like, Meister Eckhart and the others are going to be sitting on the sidelines. And it's like, well, I told you so.